I don't really know. But either way, we're going to get started. Difference, we're not going to have anybody reading bios at you because I generally find that I fall asleep when that happens. So we're going to have presentations, then we're going to go down the line, and each person is going to introduce themselves, their organizations, give their reaction to the proposals, share whatever they're thinking, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, and from there we'll take some questions from the audience. So from there, I will go ahead and turn things over to Joan O'Hara. Would you like to go first?
I would.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Joan O'Hara. I am the General Counsel for the House Homeland Security Committee under Chairman Michael McCall. I have been sort of leading the charge for the committee and for the chairman on how to respond to the developing paradigm of digital security challenges and law enforcement and counterterrorism issues. Briefly, to tell you about the legislation that we have proposed. We put forward a bill in February of this year. The idea is to create a bipartisan, bicameral commission that would be comprised of commissioners from each of 8 areas, 16 commissioners altogether, and those areas being the stakeholders that are most impacted by the issue of encryption, whether that's on the privacy side, the technology side, or the law enforcement counterterrorism side. The chairman asked me to begin looking into this issue when he was approached by Director Comey and Secretary Johnson about a growing challenge to their mission, where they were unable to access certain evidence and information and communications because the data and the communications were encrypted. No one proposed a solution to that problem, but he was made aware that this was something that was impacting law enforcement and counterterrorism missions, and also would probably continue to become more and more relevant. So with that charge, I started to bring in stakeholders from every area that we could think of that was impacted, from privacy and civil liberties groups, academics, cryptologists, state and local law enforcement, prosecutors, federal law enforcement, and a host of others, think tanks from all sides of the political spectrum, to get their thoughts and see if they had any ideas on where even to begin to approach this issue. We had very thoughtful, honest conversations with all of those groups. We met with more than 100 people over the course of probably about 6 months. And it became evident to us, the more we learned, the more complex this problem seemed to be. So as congressional staffers, we like to try and come up with solutions and propose legislation. That's what our body of government does. But it seemed to us that we didn't have all of the expertise and understanding needed to really propose a solution that didn't have some significant downsides. So on the one hand, if you propose weakening encryption or breaking encryption or making law enforcement able to access encrypted data with a warrant, you're compromising encryption more generally and causing other types of security problems. So financial records, health records, in addition to personal information, is all protected. Government information, all protected by encryption. So weakening encryption seemed like that was not going to be a smart solution. On the other hand, this is a real problem for law enforcement. They are faced more and more with what they refer to as a digital crime scene, where they're unable to collect evidence that might allow them to bring an indictment because of the encryption issue. And that's a real problem for them. We weren't thinking along the lines of mandating weakening of encryption, but we do recognize that they have new challenges and they're going to need to learn to adapt. So we were trying to bring the sides together. We wanted to actually host more of an informal roundtable with some people from the tech community, the privacy community, also from the FBI and state and local law enforcement. My boss, Chairman McCall, was eager to facilitate that conversation, not just for his own education and members' education, but for the sides to sort of hear what each other was saying. For various reasons, people didn't want to participate in that, which we thought was unfortunate. And the issue had really reached sort of a standoff. So we thought, if we can't bring people together informally, maybe it's time to put together a formal commission, bringing together all these really smart, really educated, really knowledgeable people and ask them to have a conversation among themselves and take an honest look at what are the equities and what are the challenges here. So as I'm sure you know, the debate over encryption is not really moving towards a solution at this point. I think from our perspective at least, the quote-unquote sides of the argument are becoming more entrenched. So we would really like to see an honest, robust conversation on this topic. And you know, we couldn't come up with any solutions. I don't think anyone has proposed anything, like I said earlier, that doesn't have significant trade-offs. But we're hopeful that if this commission is stood up and we bring together the right people to talk to each other and do the work, collect the data and have an honest dialogue, that maybe they will think outside of the box and come up with new ways to approach this problem that ensures security not only on the law enforcement and counterterrorism side, but also security of personal data and protects privacy. So it's certainly not an easy challenge. We recognize that. And we are humble enough to know that we don't have all the answers in Congress. But we feel like this could be a first step and a good dialogue for America. So that's kind of the thinking behind the proposal. Right now we have a companion bill in the Senate. Senator Warner from Virginia has partnered with us. So it's a bipartisan bill. My chairman's a Republican and Senator Warner is a Democrat. So it has good bipartisan support, a lot of support from leaders in all sorts of areas, from tech to law enforcement to national level thinkers. A lot of people have come out and said that they think this is the path forward. So in any event, we're hopeful. Things aren't easy to get moving in Congress, but we haven't given up, and hoping that there will be a markup of the bill on the Senate side in September, and then we'll take it from there. So happy to answer any questions you have, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joan. I'm Tim Starks with Politico. I write the morning cybersecurity newsletter. I will be moderating the panel here today. It looks like Andrew is not here yet, so perhaps we should just go down the line. If I'll introduce Justin first, or Gus. We'll go by Gus. Gus Hurwitz. He's an assistant professor of law at the Nebraska College of Law, among other things. If you'd like to introduce yourself further and give some perspective, we appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Tim, and thanks, Joan and everyone for being here. I think this is a hugely important conversation and hugely challenging conversation. I guess I should say a couple elaborate things about who I am and what I do. Gus Hurwitz, assistant professor of law at the University of Nebraska Space, Cyber, and Telecommunications program. I'm one of the few lawyers out there who has a actual tech background, having worked at Los Alamos National Lab for a couple of years prior to going to law school. I'm also one of the few lawyers out there who's actually probably implemented in code an implementation of RSA. I wouldn't say I'm an expert by any means, but some appreciation for the difficulties here. I also am a visiting scholar with a Center for Internet Communications and Technology Policy. And get your groggers out. I'm one of the few crazy people who actually came to the FBI's defense, or I should say Apple's offense, in the Apple FBI dispute. So I only should take a couple of moments to say a bit right now. I think the big thing that I will say, and we just heard this plea, I'm going to re-echo it, redouble it. Tech needs to come to the conversation in DC about encryption policy. It is desperately needed. We have seen bad proposals, bad legislative proposals put forth. Those proposals get put forth because the tech sector is not participating, is not educating, is not informing. They're taking their ball, going home and saying, we're gonna do whatever we want to do. You guys in Washington, you can't touch us. Well, guess what? Look at Russia. Encryption is now basically illegal in Russia as of this past week. Legislators can do bad things, and if they do bad things, they can throw you in jail when you don't comply with their laws. So this is a really challenging conversation. The other thing that I will say, I'm an academic, so I get to say wonky, pointy-headed things like this. Historically, if you look back at the Bell monopoly era. There was a very close relationship between government, DoD, the national military establishment, and industry technology in developing and working together to come up with solutions to technological problems. Today, we're seeing a complete divide between the government side and the tech side. The tech response to, and many academics and people in government's response to the needs of government to have technological expertise is, well, the NSA should go out and hire a bunch of $500,000 a year cryptologists to come and work for them and develop countermeasure technologies. Well, you know what? I don't want an expert cryptographer working for the government. They have more valuable, better things to do. I want them in Silicon Valley doing brilliant things and working with the government to design technologies in a way that works with the needs of national defense and criminal law and other aspects of law and policy. So we need to find a way to bridge this divide and get all sides working together. And with that, I will hand it back.
Thank you, Gus. We are now joined by Andrew Lachman, who is the Legislative Director for Congressman Ted Lieu. Do you want to talk about the proposal as one of our lightning talks here?
Which of the Encrypt Act in particular? Okay. Let's see if I can. There we go. So unfortunately, a vote got called at around 1 o'clock, so that sort of shifted my schedule. My apologies for running on politician time, right? Since I'm not really the politician on the staff. But just very quickly, a little background about my boss. My boss is one of four, Congressman Ted Lieu is one of 4 computer science majors that serve in the Congress. He double majored in political science, computer science at Stanford. And as for myself, I was a technology licensing attorney for 10 years, worked for companies like Paramount Pictures, Move.com. Should point out, of course, as standard disclaimer, that any of the opinions I share, those are of my own, not necessarily reflective of my boss or the U.S. House of Representatives. But that being said, I do think that he's right. They're right about talking about some of these divides that are out there, and parts of the problem is that now that everyone has realized that technology is so pervasive in our lives, people are trying to figure out how to focus, in some ways, how to control. And it's difficult to do because it's such a nimble technology, and government is not nimble enough to regulate anyway, because it's a years-long process, and technology changes much faster than that. So what you've got right now is while the federal government is trying to come to a consensus on how to approach encryption, the states are trying to come up with their own solutions, and that creates a risk where you can have 50 different solutions in 50 different states. We already have 3 states that I'm aware of. 2 in particular come to mind. California and New York have tried to move forward legislation to require backdoors for encryption. Well, if you've got 50 different standards, you run the risk of having, 50 different phones? So I'll put down my California phone and pick up my Pennsylvania phone if I need to make a call in the right place. So the congressman is, without taking a position on what the federal government should do, believe that we need to make sure at least the discussion happens on the federal level. And while many ideas and it's good to have states as incubators, that doesn't always make sense when you have to have uniform national rules. That's why we have a Commerce Clause, and this would be an application of it. Actually, I had one of my Republican counterparts told me that this was the best application of the Commerce Clause he'd ever seen. And granted the reputation of my side of the aisle, I took that as a great compliment. But basically, the federal government should be making these decisions, and the states should not be coming up with a patchwork of rules in which then technology needs to figure its way around. And so that's where the Encrypt Act comes in. It just says federal government needs to decide this, states should not be deciding it. And then we can come together, come together and figure out what that solution should be. The congressman has made very clear that when you create, in his opinion, his view that when you create one vulnerability for one, you create a vulnerability for everyone. Computer code is neutral, doesn't know who's accessing it, it just knows whether whether everything matches up, and if you're doing encryption, whether the key matches or not. And so when we create a vulnerability, others will try to exploit it and may find that possible. So that's a set of concerns. But that being said, I think we can all agree that a consensus needs to be found, and it's my personal belief that it eventually will be found. At equilibrium, policy tends to find equilibrium over time, or maybe I'm just the eternal optimist. And I think it will in this case as well.
Thank you, Andrew. So we'll move next to Alex Joel, who's the Civil Liberties Protection Officer for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and join this excellent panel. We're a little bit crowded up here, but hopefully that will lead to a greater intensity of discussion as we go forward. So just as at the beginning, I'd like to say as a caveat that I'm not going to be able to comment very specifically on anything, certainly nothing pending in Congress, but I will certainly try to add my perspective. I am the, my title actually was recently changed, you would have known this, Tim, but I'm now the Chief of the Office of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So we've added transparency officially to the designation of my position. I've been in this role as the transparency edition. I've been in the role for about 11 years now. I have served for all 4 directors of national intelligence, and just so people have an idea, we're all starting from the same baseline. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence is in the intelligence community. It was created in the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. This came out of the 9/11 Commission recommendations for how to better integrate our intelligence agencies to prevent another 9/11. And the idea was to create this Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and for the Director of National Intelligence to be the principal advisor to the President on intelligence matters, and to lead the coordination and integration among the various elements of the intelligence community, of which there are officially 17 different elements. So it's a diverse group of intelligence agencies, including the national intelligence components of the FBI, as well as CIA, NSA, et cetera. So I've been in this role working to figure out how to balance the considerations that we're all here to talk about between privacy and security. And I just point out, I think, something that I believe we all agree with, which is it's not really an either-or choice. It's really an and situation. And the challenge, and that's what makes it particularly hard, because we know that protecting privacy, complying with the law, complying with the Constitution, these are imperatives. We have to figure out how to do that. And security and public safety and security of the nation, security of individual communications, cybersecurity is a core part of the government's mission, and of course in the collective interest of all of us. So we have to figure out how do we do both. And I've been talking about this for a number of years. My own perspective is that one concern that people have when they think about these two considerations is that they do think of them as an either-or choice. And sometimes the metaphor of a scale comes to mind, and they're concerned that a government official sitting in a dark room will be weighing what weighs more heavily in this particular situation. Is it the security concern, the security goal we're trying to accomplish, or is it the need to protect privacy? And the concern is that the government official will always find that the security concern outweighs the privacy concern, and in a go, no-go decision, simply say go on the security and the privacy concern is not addressed. In my personal experience, that's not how it works. There are tensions, of course, between privacy and security, and we have to acknowledge that those tensions exist. And the question really is not which one to do, but rather how to do both, how to keep that scale balanced, if we're keeping that metaphor. And on the security side of the scale, is it really necessary? Are we pursuing a valid objective? Are we using the narrowest and best tailored way of doing it? Are we impacting things in the least way that we can conceive of and still accomplish the mission? So you're trying to weigh down that side of the scale as little as possible. And then on the other side of the scale, what are the protections and what are the audits, what are the oversight, what are the things that we need to do to make sure that scale is balanced? Just on the theme of a conversation, I do think that that's an important theme. Certainly this goes to what more recently my office has been focused on, which is transparency, making more information available to the public about what intelligence agencies are doing, engaging with our colleagues in civil society, and hearing their views, and trying to have that conversation across the board. So I do think that's important as a conversation not only between the government and civil society and the rest of the public and other segments of the public as well, but also, this is another theme that you already heard about here, which is the conversation between the technical experts and the policy folks. I think inevitably technology continues to change. It's very difficult for non-technologists to fully understand. We can use the products and take advantage of the benefits of technology, but do we really understand the coding? I've never coded anything in my life. My son is a mechanical engineer. Well, he graduated with a mechanical engineering degree. He may be doing something else right now. So he's a mechanical engineer. He has that engineering mindset, and I have trouble sometimes having conversations with him because he sees things in black and white. He says, is the answer this or that? And when I give him a sort of it depends from a lawyer's perspective, it can be frustrating for him. And that's just a small metaphor, I think, for sometimes the conversations we have between the policy folks and the technical experts. And we need to find a way to speak to one another in ways that we each can better understand so that we're not making the wrong choice. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alex. After that, we will have Nima Singh Giuliani, who's the Legislative Counsel with the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office.
Thanks so much. For the ACLU, encryption isn't just kind of a niche technological issue. It's very much about protecting individual rights and allowing people to effectuate their constitutional rights. And I think that sometimes gets lost in sort of the broader conversation. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think, two specific rights and facets of our values that I think encryption is so critical for. And the first is, encryption allows people to communicate freely in a way that allows them to express their First Amendment rights. I think you only have to look at our history to understand why this is so important. People like Martin Luther King were targets of government surveillance in the 60s, as were numerous activists. You look internationally, and there are human rights activists around the world who depend on the ability to be able to communicate freely, not just so they can help shape the societies they live in, but frankly, many times in order to ensure their own safety and their own security. And so I think it's really important that as part of this broader encryption debate that we understand, how critical in the modern age encryption has become to allowing the First Amendment to have some meaning. And I think, as part of that, it's also important that we have talk about how the concerns about being able to communicate free from government interference is not often a concern or burden that's borne equally by all communities. I mean, we've seen religious minorities, racial and ethnic minorities who are often targeted disproportionately by repressive regimes, by our own government in many ways. And sometimes that's through surveillance that the government feels is justified, but which we know has a very real impact on whether a protester who's fighting for an important issue feels safe and secure enough to post a message, to organize a rally or to send an email among different colleagues to help bring people together to talk about values and issues. And I think we have to be very careful about how, when we think about law enforcement concerns or proposals like mandatory backdoors, that we're not unwittingly creating a system where now people are afraid to communicate, and now they don't have the tools to organize as a society and a community, because I think we all recognize how valuable that is in terms of shaping, and correcting wrongs, but also addressing kind of the direction people would like our communities to go in. And the second piece I want to talk about that I think is important, an important piece of the debate, is also the Fifth Amendment. It gets lost a little bit in the conversation, but one of the things that courts have talked about are limits on what the government can force private parties to do to assist with a criminal investigation. The courts have recognized that there are very clear limits on what the government can do to force an innocent party to change or to assist with in order to allow them to effectuate whatever law enforcement activity they want to take. So they can force you to, for example, maybe provide testimony. If you have papers in your possession, they can force you to turn over that evidence or those documents. But I think in many cases, many of the proposals we're talking about go far beyond what courts have recognized as appropriate. I mean, when you think about the encryption debate, it's the government, maybe going to a technology company and saying, look, I want you to create a backdoor or create this software, when a technology company is saying, I think this is bad for my customers, I think this is bad for security, and I think this is bad for privacy and a lot of the values that I hold dear. And it's not something that I would do in my normal course of business. And I am troubled by some of the proposals which sort of gloss over the reality, which is that what we're doing is essentially going to private parties and private citizens and saying, now you have a mandate and you have a responsibility to build a surveillance infrastructure for our government. And sometimes that goes too far. And so for all of these reasons, these are some of the main issues that we've been thinking about when we have approached the encryption issue, and why we are so troubled by the proposals that we've seen that we think would weaken or undermine the ability of private companies or individual citizens to not just use encrypted technologies, but to develop the technologies that are so crucial for their everyday lives. And we've talked also a little bit about commissions, and I think there have been, proposals that have been, introduced, on the Hill to study this issue more fully. And I definitely appreciate, I think, the efforts by a lot of members to take a more, to take an approach that wants to study the issue better, not just have sort of a knee-jerk reaction in response to, the national security challenges or the law enforcement challenges of the day. But I think something that's really important when we think about putting together a commission or when we think about putting together groups of people to discuss this issue is that we make sure that every voice has a role in that discussion, and that there are mechanisms and protections built in so that you can't just have two civil liberties people sitting in the room who express an opinion but get overruled by everybody else. So I think it's really important to think about, as we're having this debate, how do we make sure that all voices are represented and that all of those voices have equal weight and the ability to affect the outcome? Because I think if encryption affects everybody, but there are certainly people in the U.S. and around the world who bear a greater burden of the harms that are associated with some of these proposals.
Next up, we have Matthew Miller, who's from Crypto Harlem.
Mitchell, sorry. That's okay.
Bad moderator.
Yeah, hi. I'm just going to talk about who I am and the work that I do. I used to be a developer, like a programmer, so I write that code. That's so crazy, right? And formerly, I was a data journalist at the New York Times, and now I train activists and journalists, NGOs, and a few lawyers in how to use, circumvention technologies and basic cryptography tools. Another one of my projects is for the community of Harlem, which is predominantly African American and located in Upper Manhattan. Once a month, there's a place anyone can go for 3 hours. It's just like office hours. Drop in, drop out, answer your questions, and learn about a lot of the, software that you could use, and also strange things in your neighborhood, like license plate readers and skywatch towers and biometric scanning cameras that shouldn't be there, when Neiman talks about there are people in the United States and outside the United States that are under like a higher burden, and encryption is like gives them like some bastion of safety and a place where they can actually feel like a regular American, right? Who can just like freely speak and act and do those things. I find that in the inner city, from the West Coast to the East Coast, and we have marginalized groups, whether they're trans or black and brown folk, who really, need these tools to be able to like be safe and feel like they can be part of the democratic process, etc. It's funny, like, to be sitting on, a panel in the summer of 2016 talking about encryption when, Berkman Center, I think February 1st, there was a paper. It was about this whole going dark debate, and it was called Don't Panic. And it's pretty rightfully named. I think it's like the Berkeley cybersecurity part of Berkman that published it. And it had like leading names in, crypto analysis, civil society, etc., expressing that if you actually look at it, this isn't a big problem. This isn't a reality. There's so much metadata and so much other things you can use in policing and investigating that there hasn't been this there's a case that we can't solve, and the only reason we can't solve it is because of encryption. Like, if there was, it would be like a slam dunk debate. It wouldn't be a debate, right? So in actuality, there's other things at hand. And when you talk about FBI and Apple, etc., it's really about trying to force private industry to have a precedent to break crypto. And this isn't Russia, so we can't pass a law that says like there's going to be backdoors and everything. And that would be bad because, part of how we used to do things was we'd write letters to each other. We would talk to each other at like a town hall, or on our way to the store, But now we use Facebook and email and iPhones and Gmail and banking electronically without talking to our tellers. And, we're complicated people. You're the person you are, to your friends, not the person you are with your boss, which is not the person you are with your family. But to your phone, it's an intimate device. To your laptop, it's an intimate device. It knows who you are, it knows all the different parts of you. Encryption allows us to basically be free and to be American. So I think anything that has to do with like touching encryption or affecting encryption or making laws about it needs to really speak to the professionals, as well as understand that you're affecting some Americans more than others, and it works great now, and we shouldn't really be messing with it. So that's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Matt. Last but not least, we have Amy Stepanovich from the U.S. Policy Manager with Access Now.
Good job, Tim. My name is Amy Stepanovich. Access Now is a global civil society organization that works on extending and defending the digital rights of users at risk. So when I say that, I mean we actually operate from 10 different offices, about 15 different presences all around the world, and look at the people who are on the internet who are most impacted by laws and policies and most targeted by governments. And so we have been saying for quite some time now that encryption is absolutely vital to human rights. It's one of the key pieces of policy that we tend to work on for reasons like we think that mass surveillance is probably not in line with human rights, and encryption, if nothing else, drives up the cost of surveillance. So it makes mass surveillance more difficult, and it pushes governments to do more targeted forms of surveillance. But what's great is that last year it got to the point where you don't have to listen to me say that encryption is vital to human rights anymore, because the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression actually, after a long period of consultation, wrote a report that said that encryption is actually vital to the ability of users to exercise their rights to expression and to privacy. Not only encryption, but also anonymity supporting tools tend to give users the ability to speak and to express themselves, to associate with groups that might be unpopular in certain countries. And so that is central to the human rights debate. It's not only, doesn't only exist in this world over here, it's actually right in the middle. So one of the things that Access Now does is we run a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week digital security helpline. Which means that at any point in time, if a user, activist, journalist, we really try to focus on the most vulnerable at-risk communities, is having a digital security issue, be it that their website is being DDoSed, or that they've just been arrested, or all of these different issues that come into our helpline. They can email our technicians and can get some advice or get some help. And that means that we are working on the front lines of some of the gravest human rights abuses that are occurring in relation to the internet all over the world. And so we see really at the ground level every single day through these offices how important encryption is to the human rights debate and to the people, to the individuals who are driving this discussion, who are pushing for LGBT rights in repressive regimes, who are writing about government atrocities, who are trying to do whatever they can to report on drug cartels and murders. These people all use encryption every single day, and we actually recommend that they use encryption as much as possible. And the thing is that we've been having a pretty robust discussion on encryption for more than 40 years now in the United States. Starting back in the 1970s, talking about export controls. Encryption has been something that really has been on people's minds. The government has been trying to figure out its way to push down and to route around, and we've been having these discussions. And what keeps happening is that we end up at a point where we realize that it's really impossible to start to undermine encryption and to give the FBI what they're looking for, which is a way to make sure that they can retain unfettered access to information when they want it, without also giving this huge black open door available to any bad actor who also wants to use that vulnerability to get into those communications. The problem is we've been putting years of time and energy and kind of our sweat and tears into these encryption discussions. We've been not talking about some of the conversations that we really should have been talking about that could have driven this forward. And so actually, it's really interesting that we're here in 2016 because we are now, it seems, just starting to have some of those conversations. We've started to identify what needs to be talked about. Things like government hacking, which I've never seen really an open policy conversation about before. We've known that governments are doing it. We have documentation that it's happening. But nobody's really talked about what safeguards need to be in place, and we're doing that now. Things like digital estates, what happens to your phone and your information after you die. That actually would probably, if we solve some of those problems, would take away a lot of the problems that we have with encryption, because we'd have a plan for what happens to devices after death. But we haven't had those discussions, and we're just now getting to a place where we can have them. There are other conversations that we haven't even identified yet, because we keep putting time into encryption. So I would say that really we need to start to move on. We need to have a policy statement that says that there is no way to undermine encryption. There is no way to mandate vulnerabilities. Let's assume a world where encryption is the norm. We need to assume a world where encryption is the norm. Now what do we talk about? And the problem is that by not doing that, the US and other countries have actually left a lot of room for other governments to try to pass really damaging laws, and laws that have and are going to have a huge negative impact on human rights. We've left this political space where we're talking about, oh, maybe we can balance privacy and security, and maybe we can undermine encryption only a little. And in that space, China has passed a law that essentially outlaws end-to-end encryption. Russia just last week passed a law that says that they want access to everybody's keys. Colombia has a ban on encryption outright. There are these countries, these conversations that are happening, and justifiably, in this context, if no other, they're pointing to us and saying, well, look, even the US thinks this is possible. Even the US thinks that they can comply with human rights and undermine encryption. And so that is kind of the world we've left ourselves in by continuing to engage in this debate and not moving forward into other areas. So I would challenge us to make that move forward and to have those discussions, but have those discussions where they're most needed.
Thank you, Amy. We'll try to make your wish a command here a little later. First, because we still have Joan and Andrew with us, and we might lose them to the vagaries of Congress, you never know. I had a couple specific questions for each of you. Joan, one of the criticisms I've heard about the bill that Congressman McCall has introduced is from some in the Congress and some in the tech world that they fear that the makeup of the panel, just the mere composition, might tilt it toward one particular conclusion that is more in favor of the backdoor or law enforcement position. How would you answer that?
Yes, it's actually interesting because we have had, I really personally, and I think I speak for my boss as well, I hate to think of this as two different sides, because I think ultimately everyone wants a secure country, everybody wants public safety, and everyone wants protection of constitutional rights and their privacy. But unfortunately, it seems to have fallen into two camps of either we absolutely can't touch encryption, don't even talk about it, or we absolutely have to mandate backdoors and there's no other way around it. We don't feel like that's the end of the conversation, which is why we want to have the commission. But it's, as I was saying, it's interesting because the people on both sides, the strong civil liberties groups and the strong law enforcement groups, have each told us that they feel like the commission makeup is skewed against them. So in my mind, that might be a good thing, because it means that maybe it's more neutral. We also, we tried to incorporate, and the bill's still being amended, so we have continued the conversation with the stakeholders and with the experts that we've been talking with for the last year, and are continually trying to make improvements and are very open to suggestions and constructive ideas. But what we're trying to do is represent each of the key stakeholder groups. So that involves law enforcement, intelligence, privacy and civil liberties, tech companies, cryptologists, and there are a couple others I can't remember right now. But have all of those voices in the room so that they can contribute equally. And then in terms of issuing their report and findings and recommendations, we're trying to maybe restructure the majority, which would be required to approve a report, so that no one of those 8 groups could be sort of steamrolled. It would require at least one from every single one of those key categories to approve the report. So that's something we're working on with the Senate right now. Our objective is to have this be as honest and non-political a conversation as possible. So as I said, we think we have a strong foundation with the bill that we introduced, but we are still working to make it even better.
Thank you, Joan. And I may need your input on this next one too, but it's a question specifically for Andrew. Did you see the House Homeland Security report that came out fairly recently?
We have not seen it, but I've heard some.
You've heard of it, all right.
I've heard some things about it.
It does mention Congressman Liu's bill, if I'm correct, and says, and if I'm summarizing too broadly or simply let me know, that basically it's too soon to be considering something like this kind of restriction. We don't have enough information yet to make that kind of decision. What would you say in response to that?
Well, I think well, naturally we were a little bit surprised here because we never viewed our bill as being something which was exclusionary or in conflict with particularly the Digital Security Commission. As a matter of fact, Congressman is a co-sponsor of the Digital Security Commission bill. The idea is just to make it possible and to to keep the focus where it needs to be, and that needs to be done. It's better to do that sooner than later. Otherwise, you create more static and more confusion, as we've seen from other fields, where while everyone gets their acts together, the states come up with a highly conflicting sets of rules, and then you're trying to figure out which ones to incorporate and which ones not to. And meanwhile, the technology sector needs to be out there and be competitive. And one of the, if I may throw in one personal observation from someone who's worked in the tech industry, and one of the reasons I came over to work in the government, besides the outstanding benefits and high pay that I make, is that there's a shortage of people who bother to ask how the technology works before we regulate it. That is changing, and it's changing for the better. And we're seeing a whole generation, and actually I have privilege of serving with some wonderful folks. We have now finally have a tech staff association in the Congress where we can learn from each other about the right kinds of questions to ask and how things work. But I think the more we ask those questions, the better it will all be, because there have been other sectors where we've tried to take a magic wand approach, that if we just write the rules, then somehow the laws of physics and computer science and everything will change. And at least with this conversation we're having now, we're seeing that's less and less of the case, and a real hard look at how things are actually structured before we try to write rules for them.
Thank you. So for the rest of the panel, basically at this point, unless I say specifically your name, just jump in if you have some thoughts on it. Just today, at a hearing, Senator John McCain said today that anyone who is not helping mandate government encryption, government access to encrypted information, is, quote, furthering the cause of child pornographers and human traffickers. Is he wrong, and if so, why?
Will someone please think of the children? I think that's what he said.
More or less.
I think equating encryption to criminal acts doesn't really make sense. Like, we all know that getaway cars are driven by bank robbers, but no one's trying to say, like, let's try to regulate the automotive industry and prevent cars from moving when they're near banks or anything like that. It's just, hey, most people don't rob banks, and they drive every day, and they do it moderately safely. Let's get some self-driving cars, right? But so yeah, maybe criminals do use encryption, but everyone in here who has a smartphone, you're using encryption too, and you don't look like criminals, I don't think. So I hope not. Scary, right? So you know, it's easy to say like bad people use this thing, let's outlaw this thing, but then, you know, bad people use guns, we don't outlaw guns, you know, so it's just a tool, like a car is a tool. Like math is a tool. You could use math for bad things, like, you know, or you could use math for good things, but we don't put like some chapters of your math book are redacted. And then, so, you know, as a developer, arguments like that, I don't want to say like they're overly simplified, but it's, you know, it's a little strange. And furthermore, let's say it did happen. Let's say tomorrow, encryption was banned, regulated heavily by the government. Everyone knew that if you had, every company was like, okay, Google, Facebook, Twitter, tomorrow they're like, you're right, John McCain, I'm so sorry. There is a way that, you know, with FISA or some court ruling, some, you know, checks and balances, there's a way to break crypto keys. I think everyone in the world would stop using American products knowing that that was the case. And these bad people would start to use the products that were made outside of this jurisdiction. It would only hurt regular folks, everyday folks. So that's my thoughts on it.
So my initial comment was obviously snarky, but there's a really interesting point in here, and I think you were just kind of hitting on an important distinction that I don't hear made often in these discussions, which is there's a difference between mass scale software and applications and niche applications. So one of the things folks do say is if the government requires backdoors or weakens encryption, or we find out that a specific product or a large number of products have been weakened or compromised, people will just switch to their own custom products or products from overseas, or open source software that is distributed anonymously via Tor that can be regulated. And there's a really interesting point in here. The general way this is framed is, well, yeah, the really bad criminals and the terrorists, they're going to go, and not even the criminals and terrorists, but the good guys. One of the hardest parts of encryption, as we've heard, is you do have true human rights and civil rights proponents and advocates who do or may or in the future can rely on encryption, and we don't want to jeopardize their ability. Well, these specialist groups, these people who are most concerned about their privacy, they're probably the ones who are most going to be able to divert to unregulated products, to these products that the government cannot backdoor or weaken. The interesting point here is, who are we most concerned about from a security perspective? Are we most concerned about making sure that the NSA can track down terrorists, or that the government can infiltrate civil rights groups? Or are we most concerned, and I should say, the government shouldn't be infiltrating civil rights groups, or are we most concerned about ordinary day-to-day criminal activity? The ability of the police investigating a mundane crime to execute a search warrant that isn't one of these fancy pants national security cases where we're getting millions of dollars invested into the investigation by multiple government resources. Our focus is usually on these really big national security terrorism stories or the civil rights stories. I expect the more important thing to focus on is these day-to-day, mundane, ordinary criminal law concerns with encryption. That's not what we talk about. And the thing here is, if we have mass-scale products that are supporting some form of backdoor encryption or some form of encryption that supports government access under appropriate oversight circumstances, that's going to affect the ordinary criminal law applications. Those who are really concerned about maintaining their security and their privacy and the confidentiality of their data, they're the ones who are going to be diverted to unregulated software. So arguably, the two groups that we're most talking about, the terrorists and the civil rights groups, the bad users of encryption and the good users of encryption, they'll still be able to if we only target mass market form of communications platforms. So that's a distinction that I think we should add to this discussion that's very frequently overlooked.
Sure. At another hearing today of the House Homeland Security Committee, in fact, James Comey again talked about the encryption problem from his perspective, said that the needles in the haystack are becoming increasingly invisible. Is there anyone on the panel that would disagree with the notion that law enforcement has an encryption problem?
This side.
Well, I'll start, and I'm sure you guys will fill in. I think in many respects, law enforcement is operating in, a lot of people have termed the golden age of surveillance. I mean, when you think about the amount of metadata, the amount of electronic records, the amount of information that is available today about, individuals' general movements, their communications, that was unthinkable, let's just say 20, 30, 40 years ago. I find the conversations where we talk about this panic to be, not fully supported by the facts. And it's not just me saying that. There were, experts that were pulled together by the Berkman Center who I think, came to sort of the same conclusion that kind of said, hold your horses. It's not clear that we're in this crisis that a lot of people seem to be presenting. And I think that is just one more reason where I think we really need to consider the implications of some of these policies on, all of the groups that we've talked about and on everyday people.
I mean, just to add, because I think Nina said it right, I had one technologist explain to me the difference that previously it was like you turned on a flashlight and that was your data stream. And we've moved from the flashlight world into like a supernova, because we're now generating so much more data. We have so much more information about ourselves available every single day. I know kind of where you are, where you're going, where you've been. Not only do I know the information that you've purposefully communicated or sent out into the world, but you can analyze all of that information, and a lot of the companies out there probably know more about you than you do about yourselves, and the government can compel that information to be released. So there's so much data, and encryption really has kind of put like a flashlight-sized black spot in that supernova. It's really such a small amount of data that is being covered up by encryption that it seems really disingenuous to say that it's they're going dark when there's so much more brightness than ever before. I think it was called the golden age of surveillance. Is that what you said? It's so far ahead. I just was at a session earlier where somebody compared hacking your phone to hacking your mind. And we talked about it a little bit. There are very few thoughts that I imagine go through your head, or very few things that you do every day that your phone doesn't know about you. And so the distinction between your phone and your mind is becoming increasingly irrelevant. Your phone is an extension of yourself. And that's what we're talking about protecting here. And not necessarily are we saying that encryption is helping the child pornographers and what was the other category?
Human traffickers.
Human traffickers. But a lack of encryption is only going to help the malicious hackers, the thieves, the blackmailers, the people who are trying to get at that data. So there's two sides of that coin.
Alex?
So I didn't hear Director Comey's remarks, and so I'm not going to directly comment on them. But just generally speaking, I think I agree that there's a huge amount of data that is generated by all the devices that we carry and the companies that we transact business with on the internet. So that's the reality of the world we live in. It also raises a lot of concerns in terms of how government can access and use that data, and you guys have talked about those concerns very effectively to us when we have our engagements as well as in your public advocacy. So there's no question that there's a lot of data in the world and that we have to be very careful in terms of how we regulate and oversee the government in accessing that data. And one of the principles that we have been working toward and that I think comes into play here is for us to be as targeted as possible. And in the specific examples that I've heard used in this particular discussion, it's really we're specifically focused on a particular person. And what we want to know, and oftentimes the most focused, targeted way to get information about what that person is up to in terms of a criminal activity or some other national security related activity is to look at the content of a communication that person has been transmitting and sending. And so I think the discussion in some ways from a law enforcement perspective is really we want to have the ability to get a court order and to look at that particular targeted communication, because often that content will be the most relevant, most direct way that we can get to our law enforcement public safety goal. And if the result of trying to get that undermines encryption for the nation and the world, then that's obviously the bad solution. So I haven't heard any public official saying, yes, we want to undermine encryption for all of the reasons that you guys have said. It's extremely important. Cybersecurity is one of the main goals of the government. And we understand and appreciate the role it plays in protecting human rights advocates around the world. So we We understand the value of encryption. And I haven't heard anybody in the government say that we have a magic answer. And so the question really is there a way to be focused, targeted, narrow, and come up with a way that helps the government achieve a lawful purpose while also addressing the various implications that you guys have been raising?
I actually do think that John McCain had a point that encryption is helping human traffickers and child pornographers. That's definitely a fact. It's also helping ordinary Americans who have a right to privacy, political dissidents, marginalized groups, people who need to be safe and feel safe and secure in their communications. So I think it's oversimplifying it to say that this isn't a tool that helps the bad guys. It's just that it's a tool. It's not good or bad in and of itself. Encryption is not a good thing or a bad thing. It's a tool. How it's applied, how it's used, that's what makes it good or bad. So from our perspective, and I'm speaking for the chairman and the committee, we don't think that encryption in and of itself is something that should be mandated or prohibited. We're just trying to take a realistic look at how this is impacting our current paradigm with respect to, as Amy said, hacking one's mind. I mean, we all keep loads and loads of personal information and communications on our smartphones. That's just the way it is. We're not going to go back to telephones and pen and pencil. I mean, this is a reality. But it also is a reality that because of that situation, there's a lot of evidence and information that would previously have been available to law enforcement with a lawful warrant that is no longer accessible to them. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm not commenting on that. I'm just saying that I think it's an issue that's worth discussing because it is a real problem on both sides. We want to protect privacy. We need to feel safe and secure in our communications. At the same time, those tools will be exploited by the bad actors. So how do we as a nation decide a policy that makes sense given all of those realities?
Something of a related question, and I'll start with you, Nima, since you brought it up, but if anybody has any other perspective, it's welcome. You had talked about the mandating of a surveillance infrastructure. As you know, with CALEA, the law, we do that already somewhat with telecommunications companies more traditionally. Why would that kind of structure be bad for this simply because the technology has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of practical logistical differences. I mean, to be clear, the ACLU opposed CALEA when it was passed. We had concerns with that law as it was created years ago. But I think when you look at the technology world, there's an extra layer of complexity. I mean, one, when you're talking about phones, there's largely a handful of major providers who were able to, I think, facilitate the backdoors that CALEA required. With technology, you're talking about thousands, if not millions, of not just companies that create the hardware, but then companies who create software that's used. So you have the person who's created your phone, you have the app developer who gives you WhatsApp or Signal or whatever app you use, Pokemon Go, I guess these days. And so there's a complexity there in terms of, at what level does it operate? Is the mandate or the requirement on the person who's developing the actual hardware? Is it each software developer's requirement? And I think you also have a different situation as a practical matter because there are people who are developing apps and who are developing products who are not these huge multi-million-dollar companies. That's the guy who's in his garage who either creates an app that's helpful for a handful of people or gets a start that way. And so you're talking about a much greater burden on potentially actors who are much smaller. And that has, I think, larger economic implications as well. When you think about the cost for a smaller developer or a smaller company to say, well, I've got to develop this backdoor, but I also have to develop this backdoor in a way that doesn't leave my customers too vulnerable because I don't want, let's say if it's a medical app, their data everywhere to be targeted by a hacker. And that's a really big burden to put on somebody, and that's a really big change in the way that I think a lot of developers and companies are developing their products.
So there's a lot to mine with CALIA. There's no way that we'd be able to get into this in depth, but this actually echoes the point that I was making before. The structure of CALIA isn't everyone who makes a communication switch needs to implement the CALIA capabilities. CALIA expressly exempts private networks. It's only the communication switches that are used by telecommunications carriers. So an important distinction to understand or to think about when we think about, do we want to impose requirements for the use of encryption on modern edge-based communications platforms, be they phones, software platforms, apps, what's not, not WhatsApp, is we wouldn't want to implement these, we wouldn't want to impose these capability requirements on every platform. We would want to implement them on platforms that reach a certain scale. And that's what CALIA did. It said we have a centralized communications network that has certain communications hubs. And it doesn't even say every hub needs to support the CALIA capabilities requirements. It says that within the network, the capabilities need to be distributed such that these capabilities are preserved. So we could imagine a world, and this is a conversation that I think we need to have, in which we say platforms above a certain size need to support certain capabilities. And that preserves the capability or the ability of the smaller apps, the startup apps, the apps that are used by communities that are concerned about surveillance to use encryption. So this isn't a binary discussion. There is a lot of area between the extremes that we really need to plumb.
I feel that it's hard to measure scale when we're not Ma Bell cutting down trees and looping wires on it. We're someone who, from just writing code in a basement, can create a game that everyone is playing across the country in a couple days. So, you know, you can't say like, okay, these are the 5 major telcos. Who are the 5 major messaging apps? It could change tomorrow. And so it becomes almost like impossible to regulate and impossible to enforce. And you can have someone who basically has no capability of enforcing it. I think, you know, when it comes to regulating encryption from a developer, it's important to remember people write code right now, there's no backdoors. But when's the last time you didn't hear about a breach? When, you know, we have office personnel management breaches, we have target breaches. There's 0 ways in, and it's porous. What happens when you make 1 way in? The whole thing's broken.
And just one more word about the small developer, because right now, if you switch it so that a developer, once it reaches a certain scale, has to implement a backdoor, what you're doing is you're requiring these people to monetize their product much more quickly, which means where you, from a data protection standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, you would want to minimize how much data these companies are collecting about their users. What they would actually be incentivized to do is to start collecting a lot more data, a lot faster, probably before they can even properly secure it, so they can start monetizing it, because they're going to have to put this extra capability into their device much faster. So all of the incentives then just kind of flip on their heads and become backward.
We'll stay with you, Amy, and you can start us off on this one, perhaps. What is the role of the United States in the international arena on encryption? Should we be pushing an agenda at international meetings like IGF?
Sure. So actually, we think that the U.S. certainly had and probably still has an opportunity to take a leadership role on this issue. As somebody who has really been at the forefront of the technology scene, the U.S. still has probably houses most of the technology companies in the world, certainly the largest ones. We have kind of been ahead of the game. We also have had conversations about encryption happening in this country for far longer than any other country has been discussing this issue. So we should be a lot further out ahead of the matter. Earlier this year, was it this year? 2016 has been a long year. Access Now and EFF and several of our partners actually launched a We the People petition at savecrypto.org asking the president directly under his own platform to take a specific position on encryption. And what we would have liked him to say is that encryption shouldn't be compromised. We have not had a substantive response to that petition yet. We're now mid-July. there's not much time left in his tenure. So we're hoping that we get something positive soon, probably before the end of the year, because we don't see necessarily the position getting stronger in January. In fact, I think there's some potential for it to get a whole lot worse if we wait. So the time is really now for if the U.S. is going to take a leadership role, it's now when they have to do it.
And I'm just gonna say, like, as far as IGF, IGF exists in different chapter nations, but this is the USA. So, we brought you baseball and apple pie. We brought you Hollywood. We brought you hip hop and blues. And, there are certain things where people are just innovative and creative. It's called this American spirit. And you look at how the United States deals with the press and how the United States deals with things that every country needs to deal with. And they're like, oh, that's the American way, right? And that's the way that we should be dealing with things like encryption and privacy. We don't block voices. We don't take them down. We debate. We come together. We think about it. Our diversity is our strength. That's the America that I love and the America that I thought I lived in. And when things like this start getting dismantled, it becomes another place. All of a sudden, you have things running amok. And when government goes and affects the tech sector too much, it might be okay in this version of the government, but who knows what the government looks like? We don't live in dictatorships here, so who knows what our leader looks like 4 years from now, 8 years from now? Laws are forever.
No, I'm not going to attack apple pie. But I will say this, the United States has another leadership role. We have constitutional protections for privacy that many countries don't have. And we're in many ways viewed as an example for protecting voices that not always can be heard in other places. And in that way, I think people will continue and should continue to look to the United States. Does that mean we're perfect? No. But we at least aspire toward that. And that's what's enabled us to have the leadership to make what we have here today in front of us possible. The internet would not exist without the United States innovation and ingenuity, and those freedoms and those protections that we have in the system, which has become an example for so many others.
Thank you.
I was
Go ahead.
going to say, I think there's also a very practical component for why the U.S. should take a leadership role in this. I mean, can you imagine if every country, sets its own encryption policy? Like, I buy a phone, I decide I want to travel, next month. Do I have an NSA-ready phone that I take to whatever country I'm traveling with? Do I get a brand new phone? Can you imagine companies? I think by and large, a lot of people think it's very valuable that the tech sector has been really important for the U.S. economy. For companies to now have this additional burden to design, different software and different mechanisms if they want to serve different populations. And, if that's a burden that exists on U.S. companies but doesn't, let's say, exist on a handful of other companies, are they going to have a competitive edge? So it's not just a privacy issue. It's not just about the U.S., spreading good values to the rest of the world. It's also about, maintaining, I think, the health of the economy and the health of many of our companies.
So it sounds as though we might need a commerce clause for the world. But this is a really big problem. And I think back to when China's leader visited the United States last year. The first place he went wasn't the White House, it was Silicon Valley. China is a much larger market for US tech firms than the United States. So there's a concern that if China or China and Russia, or China and Russia and India, or suddenly 3.5 billion people, that's a pretty big market, 10 times the size of the United States. If those governments say, hey, Silicon Valley, if you want to do business here, you need to develop these certain technologies, well, suddenly we're the follower. Because we have insisted on not designing these sort of technologies, the companies are going to be designing technologies to someone else's specification. Whereas if we were to work with Silicon Valley and say, okay, let's design something that works for us, and then when China comes to you, you can say, okay, this isn't exactly what you want, but gives you some of the capabilities you want. I know this is a terrible world I'm describing. I'm not happy about it, but realpolitik, this is the world we live in. Then Silicon Valley could say, okay, we have this technology that we've designed. It's not as draconian, as authoritarian as you want, but it gives you 90% of the evilness that you want to be. And we recognize you're going to be evil anyhow, so go forth and be evil. Well, it's kind of a form of horrible, but a form of leadership. And it's better than us not ending up following in the world.
If I could just jump in, there's I think one area that we have served as a very positive example, which is engaging in this kind of dialogue and having a discussion where we're trying to figure out what the right solution is and not coming up with a one-size-fits-all imposed answer. So we're having the discussion, we're having the dialogue. The president is engaged, she's spoken publicly about it. I understand you're waiting for more. Congress is obviously engaged. So I think in many ways our system of government is working as you guys, I think, would have it work in terms of addressing this issue.
And we're almost to time for questions here, so everybody get ready for that. If you have something in mind, be prepared. I had one last question for Alex before we move to that section. You probably have seen various news stories about the divisions within the administration over encryption, from strong to weak, backdoor to no backdoor. How would you characterize the sort of executive branch view on this? Is there one way to do it? Are there a lot of differences between the intelligence community and, say, Commerce Department on this subject?
Let me tell you what's really going on behind the scenes. No, transparency goes so far. No, there are a range of views in the government, just like there are in society as a whole. I think, but I think what I've been trying to say reflects what I've observed of the discussion inside, which is there's a recognition that these are very tough issues, very important issues. There isn't an easy solution. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. We have to figure out a way to do both, which is why I started with the balance, because to me, this whole discussion really brings to mind different versions of different discussions we've had over the last decade or so that I've been doing this. You know, so law enforcement and the government has a particular public safety or national security or law enforcement need in mind that they're trying to satisfy. Technology has changed and continues to change very rapidly. And there are privacy implications that arise when the government is thinking about doing something new or different with given changes in technology. And how do you come to terms with it? How do you figure out what is the way forward that helps the government accomplish its mission in as focused a way as possible, and addressing the different privacy and civil liberties implications that come up. So the system is far from perfect. There are a lot of differences differences of opinion inside the government, outside of the government. But to me, this is just another round of that kind of discussion.
Thanks. Are there questions from the audience? We have one here. The man in the white jacket. Is it white? It might be more burgundy or... No, not burgundy. Definitely not burgundy. Absolutely the wrong... Tan?
Yeah, thanks. This is Andrew Bridges, Fenwick and West San Francisco. I have a question for Ms. O'Hara, because you made a statement earlier that I'm not sure I quite understand. You said there was once information available to law enforcement that is no longer available. I think that's what you said. It seems to me that what I hear from government is that it complains that it has less of the pie than it used to have, it may have a less of a share of all available information than it once had, but that pie is infinitely larger. Did the government ever have a way of tracking what I looked up in an encyclopedia? Did it ever have a way of knowing what route I was calculating to drive cross-country the way it does now? Was the government ever able to recreate the movements minute by minute of 200 million Americans the way it has now? It seems to me that the government has vastly more information than ever before. And that I think in law school I learned something called tax expenditure theory in taxation class. And that theory is that the government considers a tax expenditure to be any penny in the economy that it doesn't collect. And I'm wondering if what the feeling is, not that the government really has less information than it once had, but it doesn't have all the information it wants. I would like to hear your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, that's not what I was saying. My thought is that where we store a lot of data on this, we used to store it in like a filing cabinet, or we'd write something down, or we'd mail letters. We might have pictures in a box or photo album or something like that. We might make phone calls that previously maybe could have been tapped or something like that. There's specific kinds of information, I think, that were at one point accessible to law enforcement with a warrant that they can't, like physically can't access now because the information is encrypted. So say you have a file that's stored on your smartphone, which is encrypted, whereas previously they would go to a judge, get a warrant, and be able to request that file or go into your filing cabinet and access it. They might still have a warrant that allows them to access that information, but because it's encrypted, they can't look at it. So, sorry if that wasn't clear.
Other questions? Here with the purple tie. I meant burgundy. I meant burgundy.
So, to the extent that encryption is actually a problem that somehow needs a solution, two solutions come to mind, and I was just wondering if anyone on the panel has thoughts. One, legal hacking. Two, ending the war on drugs. Do you think either of those two things are viable solutions to this problem? Because I have a hard time believing that it's only terrorism and child pornography that's driving this law enforcement frustration. It's got to be something else, and the bulk of their work seems to be fighting the war on drugs.
Well, it's empirically, I think, the case that a large number of the FBI's requests to get phones decrypted relate to drug cases. So I think there's a data point there that suggests ending the war on drugs could have ripple effects on this area, but that seems to me probably like it's tail wagging the dog. One idea that I would throw out, and I forget who it was, Nima or Amy who made this point earlier, there could be solutions to these problems that come from out of left field from our perspective. One of the biggest complexities in this general area is with the states. What happens if I die to my data? In the old world, in the pre-encryption world, there were lots of people who would be able to get access to it to finish up my affairs. This is a huge problem for the law. This is a huge problem in family law right now. It's going to become a huger and huger problem over the next couple of decades. And I expect there's going to be a lot of demand for Silicon Valley to come up with technological solutions to make sure that the executors of your estate can get access to your encrypted information for the purposes of addressing your estate, your affairs. Well, that solves the problem in many ways.
Yeah, so I think in response to both of your questions, I mean, I think the first with hacking, I think we know based on disclosures, based on leaks, that the government, the FBI is engaging in certain types of hacking, right? I think one of the concerning things that, from my perspective, is that we have no idea what they're doing. I have yet to see, a public policy that lays out, here are the standards we apply for hacking. Here's how we consider the effect on third parties. Here's how we assess whether hacking is appropriate or not. And I think it is very concerning that it seems like there are parts of the government that are marching forward with hacking when we haven't had the robust public debate that requires. I mean, you can imagine the effects that could, result from a government hacking operation. They're inserting malware on one computer that's, connected to a network that involves a hospital, involves medical professionals, involves everyday people, and because of that, we all have sort of an effect, or we all have sort of a more porous product or a product that doesn't work. You can imagine, other scenarios where, hacking for one piece of information exposes all other types of information because it's not targeted enough. And I don't think that this is a decision that should be left up to individual agencies to make under sort of a secret cloak. It's a conversation that should be debated in public. It's a conversation that should be debated in Congress. And if after all of that debate, there's a decision that there are certain types of hacking we want to allow, it should be pursuant to a law Congress passes, not a procedural rule change, not an administrative procedure. It should be something that is written in the law so the public knows. In regards to, I think, your war on drugs question, I think it really speaks to a larger problem and a larger issue, and that's, when we think about encryption, and we think about, things that would require, backdoors and encryption, we can't divorce it from biases and problems that exist in the, the criminal justice system. We talk a lot about search warrants, right? Well, if you had a backdoor, you would only use it if the law enforcement had a search warrant. It's very true that in a lot of jurisdictions, there are racial disparities and biases in execution of search warrants. Those problems are not going to go away or magically be erased by some, encryption rule that seems neutral on its face but is layered on a criminal justice system that has biases at various levels. And so I do think that we need to think about it holistically. We need to think about, handing tools to jurisdictions and to entities that may already have problems and existing problems that have gone unresolved. And I think that is something that hasn't been as present in the conversation as it should be.
Andrew?
With respect to the hacking issue, and by the way, I think the tie is more of a purple, but.
I'm going to stop talking about what people are wearing.
Okay.
That's just not going to happen anymore going forward.
Is it a blue dress? Is it a white? Anyway, that's a whole nother internet panel. We'll do that one later. There was some discussion, actually there's been some changes I think that just came up to Rule 41, which actually go to that. And there's been some discussion about whether those changes make it easier for the government to be able to do this sort of hacking. And that change was not, some people have felt that change was not done in an open process as should have been done, and there are some efforts to try to get that decision reviewed. So I think the question you bring up is something that we're currently walking through as well.
There was a question in the audience with the microphone already.
First a comment and then a question. The comment is to dispel the apparent angst that Justin and Amy have over the decedent's estate electronic asset issue. The Uniform Law Commission last year concluded a 2-year study and produced a model act which has now been passed in I think about a half a dozen states that resolves the question of what the obligation of electronic account holders is to the survivors of those who had encrypted and password protected accounts. So I think we're moving away from that being a problem. The question that I have is one that's been implicit in some of this discussion, and it goes to scale. With a 500 billion daily lookups in the traditional network and many hundreds of billions more levels of activity through Twitter and Facebook lookups, just the sheer volume of data that is being moved on a daily basis is moving to larger and larger numbers at an almost exponential rate. And collection programs, Einstein, for example, predicated on sucking in lots of data that might have homeland security significance, start losing their logical substrate by that sheer volume. I'd like to hear comments from those of you on the panel who understand that scale issue and put it into perspective from your own context and experience. What do you think that means for civil liberties, for the surveillance and collection activities of law enforcement and the intelligence community? It poses a huge challenge to the protection of privacy constructs as we understand them today, and I don't think we've even begun to debate that.
Anyone with NSATS want to disclose?
So I guess what I'll say is, and this alludes to a point we were making earlier, which is it's absolutely correct that there's an explosion. I don't know if explosion is the right word, but there's just enormous volumes of data that are going around the world. And it just gets more and more every day. And it's not the government placing data generating devices on everybody. It's companies that are selling us products and services and that we're using and accessing through all of these devices and creating much more data about ourselves electronically than has ever been the case. And so it is absolutely correct, and organizations outside of government are trying to deal with it, with big data analytics and things like that. How do you harness this enormous amount of data? For the government, I know that this is a tired metaphor, and that people can poke holes in it, but it's just one that always comes to my mind. It's really the needle in the haystack issue. So we know that there's a lot of hay and increasing, I'm going to torture this metaphor, there's increasing amounts of hay that are in the world, and it makes it harder and harder, given all of that, to identify the needle. Another way to think about it is the signal and noise. So there's a lot of noise, where's the signal? It's just a big challenge, and we, from a privacy and civil liberties perspective, are very aware that the more data there is, the more of a concern there is that we're collecting and using and looking at people who are entirely innocent and of no interest. And I can tell you from a mission perspective in the national intelligence community, there is no interest to look at data that does not relate to mission. So they're very focused on finding the specific information that they need to accomplish their mission. But we're aware that given all this data, that there are potential implications. So we try to address it at the collection end, at the retention end, at the dissemination end, using different, what are the implications of the different analytic tools. I don't see, again, I've never thought that there's a silver bullet answer to any of this stuff. And one of the things that I feel like we're doing differently now than what we've done before is trying to be more transparent and more open. And we have way more to do in that area. But we've made a start in trying to really have more public conversations about these issues, trying to disclose more information, and trying to make it more readily understandable to the public so that they can better understand what it is we're doing, what we're focused on, and what we're not doing.
All right, we have time for one more quick question.
Sorry, I was just going to say one thing that I think your question alluded to. I think there's often a misconception that more data is always better for national security and law enforcement. And I think that the testimony of investigative experts and our own history demonstrates that's actually not true. That in some cases it makes it much harder for law enforcement and national security experts to focus on real threats. I mean, the most recent example I can think of is the nationwide call metadata program. Metadata for everybody in the U.S. Independent analysis found that wasn't a very effective tool. And I think that that's one of the reasons that sometimes get lost, why it's so important to have higher standards for when law enforcement can get data. I mean, that in and of itself forces focus on individuals that should be a higher priority for law enforcement, or at least helps to assist in a more focused approach. And you hear that from agents who have a lot of experience doing these things, that it's sometimes hard to synthesize so much data and process it, and sometimes you can lose the actual needles because you're in your haystack, I guess, to use your metaphor.
With that better control, sometimes you end up looking for a needle in a stack of needles.
So thank you. We have 2 more minutes total, and we have one last question here.
Thanks so much. Jack Spilsbury, formerly with State, currently unaffiliated. I wondered as a final thought whether the panel might turn back to the issue that's been touched on quite a bit of the global scale and ramifications of anything that happens, and looking at 2 particular areas, one being the U.S. Having just concluded negotiations with the EU. Obviously, those negotiations with the EU were acquired after the Snowden affair, when the EU court rejected the existing safe harbor arrangement. So they've just negotiated. It's going to go back to the courts there. It already is clear. We also we talked about Russia and China, but the real question is all the countries in between. It's Brazil, it's India, et cetera. And those countries, we have seen them earlier try to pass legislation or actually create regulations which they later failed to ever implement because of persuasion that took place. But our ability to persuade may be affected by things we do domestically.
Thanks. Who wants to take that one quickly?
So I think we have a law now in China. We have a law now in Russia. There are countries that are still debating this, that there are time to influence. The first one that comes to my mind is India, which has been brought up a few times. Last year, India released a draft policy on encryption that allowed encryption, but required unencrypted information to be stored next to the encrypted information. My words, I don't have them. And they withdrew it within days, if not the same day. But that new policy that's going to replace the draft is coming. And so you're seeing countries that are analyzing the situation right now, that are looking for solutions. They're going to be looking to the US. And we know that countries emulate each other. We know this on data retention. One country pops up and says, we're going to have mandatory data retention, and all of the countries follow. And so we're seeing that now with encryption, and all of the countries are kind of tumbling on board. And so this is really, some countries are lost, but there's still time to influence the global conversation.
And you also asked about Privacy Shield. I think that what the safe harbor being struck down by the courts, but the Privacy Shield agreement demonstrates is that there's a lot of concern from some of our international partners overseas about U.S. surveillance practices and laws. And the reality that they, in some cases may permit, massive or bulk collection, that they don't necessarily provide appropriate protections for retention and use for not just U.S. persons but non-U.S. persons, and that there's not appropriate remedies and transparency in place. And so now that there's this new Privacy Shield agreement, the ACLU's position has been that based on the court's ruling, we think that there needs to be more robust surveillance reform in the U.S. before you can have an agreement where our European partners feel comfortable with data being passed back and forth between the U.S. and the EU, so that they can feel that their citizens' data is appropriately protected. And until you have that, I think you're going to have things like the Privacy Shield or the Safe Harbor ruling, where you see other countries saying, hey, I don't know if I want our citizens' data being transited overseas because it may be subject to access improperly.
I'm afraid we're over our time limit here, so I think we have to run. Just wanted to thank the panel and thank you all for attending and participating.